February 2nd, 1943. Berghof, Bavaria. The last transmission from Stalingrad came through at dawn. Then, silence. Adolf Hitler stood at his desk, hands pressed against the map of southern Russia. The room smelled of cold ash and stale coffee. Outside, snow fell in the Bavarian Alps. Inside, the war had just changed. His adjutants waited. No one spoke. He picked up the telephone receiver, put it down, picked it up again. Then he walked out of the room. They thought it was rage. But the men who saw his face knew something else. He had finally understood. The Wolfschanze Command Center, 2 days earlier. January 31st. General Zeitzler stood before a table covered in red-marked maps. Candles flickered. The generators had failed again. In the corner, a radio operator adjusted his headset, listening to static from the east. 6th Army, 300,000 men, surrounded since November. For weeks, Hitler had promised relief. Manstein would break through. Göring's Luftwaffe would supply them. The front would hold. But now the radio messages were erratic, desperate, coded, rations exhausted, ammunition critical, requesting permission to... The line cut. Zeitzler looked up. His face was gray. Hitler had been pacing for hours. He kept repeating the same phrase. They will hold. They must hold. No one corrected him anymore. Because deep in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army, had just surrendered 91,000 starving survivors to the Red Army. The Eastern Front's spine had broken. 11 months earlier, everything had been different. June 1942. Operation Blue. The Wehrmacht swept across the southern steppe like a summer storm. Panzer columns raced toward the Caucasus oil fields, the Volga River, and with it, the city of Stalingrad, lay open. Hitler called it the decisive campaign. Capture Stalingrad, cut Soviet logistics, seize Baku's oil. The war would be over by winter. General Paulus was confident. His 6th Army was the Reich's finest. 270,000 men, 500 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces. Veteran troops who had fought from Poland to Moscow. By September, they controlled 90% of the city. German newspapers showed soldiers planting swastika flags on factory rooftops. Goebbels declared Stalingrad as good as taken. But the Soviets didn't leave. They fought building by building, room by room, sewer by sewer. And while the Wehrmacht bled itself in the rubble, something was happening beyond the flanks. Soviet factories in the Urals were running 24 hours a day. New divisions, Siberian, Central Asian, were moving west by rail. Zhukov was planning. The Germans saw none of it, because Hitler had made a decision in August that sealed everything. He split army groups south. Half went toward the Caucasus, half went into Stalingrad. Neither had enough strength to finish the job. By November, the 6th Army was a fist punching through a wall, with nothing behind it but air. November 19th, 1942. Operation Uranus. At 7:30, Soviet artillery opened fire along the Don River. 3,500 guns. The Romanian 3rd Army, holding the German left flank, collapsed within hours. The next day, the southern pincer attacked. By November 23rd, the trap closed. The 6th Army was encircled. Encircled, 300,000 men, 100,000 horses, 10,000 vehicles. Trapped in a pocket 50 kilometers wide. Hitler's response was immediate. The army will hold Stalingrad and await relief. Hermann Göring promised the Luftwaffe could supply them. We need 500 tons of supplies per day, the quartermaster reported. We can deliver 600, Göring said. The reality, day 1, 90 tons delivered. Day 7, 60 tons. Day 20, 40 tons. Day 45, 15 tons. Weather, distance, Soviet fighters. The airlift was fantasy. By December, horses were being slaughtered for food. By January, there was nothing left to burn for heat. Manstein tried to break through. Operation Winter Storm. His panzers got within 48 kilometers of the pocket, then stalled. Paulus requested permission to break out and link up. Hitler. No retreat. The gap closed. Manstein pulled back. The Sixth Army was alone. The industrial equation. The Soviets were producing 2,000 tanks per month, 3,000 aircraft per month, 25,000 artillery pieces per month. Germany was producing 500 tanks per month, 1,000 aircraft per month, losing men faster than they could train replacements. The casualty math. Since June 1941, Germany had lost 1.2 million dead or missing, 3 million wounded, 80% of frontline divisions under strength. The Soviets had lost more, far more, but they had more to lose. By January 1943, Soviet reserves were arriving. German reserves were gone. In the Wolfschanze, the maps told the story. Red arrows everywhere, blue defensive lines bending, and in the center of it all, a pocket that no longer responded to radio. General Zeitzler placed the casualty reports on Hitler's desk. Mein Führer, the Sixth Army can no longer. I did not ask for excuses. But the numbers didn't care about orders. In Stalingrad, 300,000 became 100,000, then 91,000, too weak to hold rifles. On January 31st, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket. On February 2nd, the northern pocket followed. 23 German divisions, gone, the largest German defeat in history, and the radio in Berghof went silent. Hitler didn't rage. That's what surprised everyone. He walked to the window overlooking the mountains, stood there for 20 minutes, silent. His hands, they said later, were shaking. Because the realization wasn't about Stalingrad. It was about what Stalingrad meant. For 2 years, the German war machine had run on a single assumption: one more offensive, one more summer, one more decisive blow. France had fallen in 6 weeks, Yugoslavia in 11 days, Greece in 3. The Wehrmacht didn't fight long wars. It fought short, violent campaigns, then won. But the Soviet Union hadn't collapsed. And now, at Stalingrad, the Wehrmacht had poured in everything: elite troops, veteran commanders, months of urban combat, and been swallowed whole. 300,000 men, the best infantry divisions Germany had, gone. Not retreating, not regrouping, gone. Hitler had believed in will, in the power of refusal, in the idea that orders could overcome logistics. If I order it held, it will be held. But the men in Stalingrad had believed too. They had held until they starved. They had fought until their ammunition ran out. They had obeyed every order, and they had still lost. Because will doesn't stop frostbite. Orders don't create food. Loyalty doesn't summon reinforcements that don't exist. Albert Speer visited Hitler 3 days after Stalingrad fell. He found him staring at casualty lists. "We cannot replace these losses," Speer said quietly. Hitler didn't respond. "The Soviets are producing 4 times our tank output. Their manpower reserves are..." "I know." 2 words. That was all. Because Hitler did know. He had known since November that the Sixth Army couldn't be supplied. He had known since December that Manstein couldn't break through. He had known since January that Paulus was doomed. But he had given the orders anyway. Because to allow retreat was to admit the Eastern Front could not be won. And if the Eastern Front could not be won, Then everything else, North Africa, the Atlantic, the factories, the oil, the war itself, was lost. Stalingrad wasn't a battle. It was the moment the Wehrmacht's offensive power died. After Stalingrad, Germany never launched another successful strategic offensive in the East. After Stalingrad, every operation was defensive, reactive, desperate. The maps in the Wolfschanze showed it clearly. 1941, blue arrows driving east. 1942, blue arrows reaching the Volga. 1943, red arrows everywhere. And Hitler knew. He stopped taking calls from the front. He stopped attending daily briefings. He began talking about miracle weapons. Rockets, jets, super tanks that would turn the war around. But in the quiet moments, his staff saw it. The way he looked at maps, the way he touched the Eastern Front with one finger, then pulled his hand away. He had realized, not that Stalingrad was lost, that the war was lost. He just couldn't say it. Why couldn't it be saved? Because the German war economy was built for a different war. The Wehrmacht had prepared for blitzkrieg, short, brutal campaigns solved by tactical brilliance and superior training. The goal was to avoid long wars of attrition, because Germany couldn't win those. The numbers made it clear. Industrial capacity. The Soviet Union, even after losing Ukraine and Western Russia, still controlled 60% of its coal, 70% of its steel, 90% of its oil. Baku was never captured. Soviet factories, relocated east of the Urals, were untouchable by German bombers. Germany, by contrast, was running out of everything. Oil. The Wehrmacht consumed 7 million tons per year. Germany produced 1 million domestically. The rest came from Romania, which the Soviets were now approaching. Manpower. Germany had 80 million people. The Soviet Union had 190 million. Germany was conscripting teenagers and old men. The Soviets were still bringing up fresh divisions from Siberia. Logistics. The German rail system in Russia was a nightmare. Soviet tracks were wider. Every captured line had to be re-gauged. The deeper Germany advanced, the longer the supply lines. By Stalingrad, trucks were breaking down faster than they could be replaced. The Soviets, by contrast, were fighting on interior lines. Their supplies traveled hundreds of kilometers. German supplies traveled thousands, under partisan attack, winter conditions, constant air raids. The intelligence failure. German intelligence had fatally underestimated Soviet reserves. Before Barbarossa, Wehrmacht planners believed the Red Army had 200 divisions. The real number was 400. By 1943, it was 600. The Germans kept destroying Soviet divisions, then facing new ones the next week. Where were they coming from? Siberia, Central Asia, the Urals. Populations the Germans didn't know existed. And while the Wehrmacht bled its veterans, the Soviets were learning. 1941, Soviet tactics, suicidal frontal attacks. 1943, Soviet tactics, deep operations, encirclements, combined arms. They had studied German methods, then industrialized them. The strategic trap. Hitler's greatest mistake wasn't Stalingrad. It was believing he could dictate the terms of the war. After 1941 failed to knock out the USSR, Germany needed peace in the East to survive, to consolidate, to prepare for the inevitable Allied invasion of France. But Hitler refused to negotiate. He refused to trade territory for time. He refused to retreat. Because retreat meant admitting the offensive had failed. And once you admit that, the entire basis of German strategy collapses. So instead, Germany held. And holding meant feeding men into a front that stretched from Leningrad to the Caucasus. 4 million men, spread across 2,000 miles. against an enemy with unlimited space, brutal winters, and a population willing to endure unspeakable losses. The Eastern Front wasn't a war Germany could win. It was a war Germany couldn't afford to stop fighting. And Stalingrad was the moment that became undeniable. The reserves were gone. The veterans were dead. The panzers were burned out. And the Red Army was just getting started. After Stalingrad, the dominoes fell. March 1943, Kharkov briefly retaken, then lost again. July 1943, Kursk, the last German offensive, 3,000 tanks, the largest tank battle in history. A failure. 1944, Operation Bagration. The Red Army destroys Army Group Center, worse than Stalingrad. 1945, Berlin. Hitler had 2 more years. 2 years of fighting, 2 years of orders, 2 years of refusing surrender. But the war ended in February 1943. He just didn't announce it, because to announce it would mean admitting he had been wrong. That will couldn't overcome math. That courage couldn't stop tank production. The German soldiers who froze in Stalingrad deserved better. They fought with extraordinary bravery. They endured unimaginable conditions. They obeyed every order. But they were ordered to do the impossible. And when the impossible failed, they were blamed for lacking will. Paulus was never forgiven for surrendering. Hitler called him a coward. But Paulus had held 3 months longer than any sane commander would have. He had watched his men die of starvation because he believed relief was coming. It never was. The lesson of Stalingrad isn't about tactics or bravery. It's about the fatal cost of denial. Hitler knew by November that the Sixth Army couldn't be saved. But he couldn't allow retreat, because retreat meant the strategy had failed. So 300,000 men paid for his refusal to accept reality. Denial didn't stop the Red Army. It just made the defeat total. In the end, will is not enough. Courage is not enough. Even loyalty is not enough. War is mathematics. And the equation at Stalingrad was simple. You cannot hold what you cannot supply. You cannot fight what you cannot replace. And you cannot win a war you refuse to see clearly. Hitler realized this in February 1943. But by then, it was far too late. The Eastern Front couldn't be saved. It never could have been. He just hadn't wanted to know.